When a leader insists he bears no responsibility for a war that has already consumed countless lives, the real battle often shifts from the battlefield to the narrative itself. In today's video, we take a sharp, clear-eyed look at Vladimir Putin's latest statements on the Ukraine war, his denial of responsibility, his praise of a US-backed peace plan, and his attempt to recast Russia as a reluctant participant rather than the driving force of the conflict, and unpack what these claims really mean against the backdrop of ongoing offensives, territorial demands, and mounting evidence of banned weapons use. At the core of Vladimir Putin's latest statements lies a familiar Kremlin strategy: redefine the origin of the war in order to erase responsibility for its consequences. By insisting that Russia did not start this war and tracing the conflict back to what he repeatedly labels the 2014 coup in Ukraine, Putin is not offering a neutral historical interpretation. He is advancing a political narrative designed to legitimize aggression after the fact. This framing deliberately ignores the central reality recognized by international law and the vast majority of the global community. Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, crossing internationally recognized borders with its armed forces. No amount of rhetorical backdating can change that fundamental point. Putin's reference to the Euromaidan revolution as a coup is especially revealing. In Western political language, Euromaidan is widely understood as a mass civic uprising driven by public opposition to corruption and the rejection of Ukraine's European path by its then-president. By contrast, the Kremlin's terminology recasts popular protest as illegitimate regime change, thereby portraying Ukraine as a state born of chaos and manipulation rather than democratic agency. This is not a semantic dispute, it is the ideological foundation upon which Russia claims a moral right to intervene, occupy territory, and dictate Ukraine's political future. Equally important is Putin's claim that Russia refrained for a long time and sought a peaceful solution through the Minsk agreements. While it is true that the Minsk process existed, his version omits crucial context. Russia was not a neutral mediator in Donbass, it was an active participant, supplying weapons, personnel, and political backing to separatist forces. Multiple independent investigations and intelligence assessments have documented Russia's role long before 2022. To suggest that Moscow was merely a patient observer betrayed by Kiev and the West is a selective retelling that collapses under even minimal scrutiny. This narrative becomes even more cynical when placed alongside the question posed by the American journalist, whether Putin would bear responsibility for deaths in the future if Russia rejects a US-brokered peace initiative. His answer, a categorical denial of responsibility, is striking not just for what it says, but for what it refuses to acknowledge. Responsibility in war is not limited to who fired the first shot a decade ago, it extends to decisions made today. Continuing offensive operations, maintaining maximalist demands, and dismissing Ukrainian sovereignty are active choices, not inherited inevitabilities. By repeatedly stating that Russia is ready for negotiations while simultaneously demanding that Ukraine surrender Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, Putin empties the concept of peace talks of real meaning. Negotiation, in this context, is redefined as capitulation. This contradiction, professing openness to peace while insisting on terms that no Ukrainian government could accept, suggests that the rhetoric of dialogue functions more as a diplomatic shield than a genuine offer. Domestically, it reinforces the idea that Russia is under siege by hostile forces and therefore morally absolved of the war's human cost. Internationally, it seeks to muddy the waters, especially among audiences fatigued by the conflict and eager for any narrative that promises stability. The danger of this approach is not merely historical distortion, it normalizes the idea that powerful states can retroactively justify wars by redefining their origins. While Vladimir Putin presents himself as a leader open to compromise and dialogue, his remarks about the US-brokered peace plan reveal a calculated use of strategic ambiguity. By praising Donald Trump's efforts and claiming that Russia practically agreed to proposals during the August 15, 2025 meeting in Anchorage, Putin appears eager to project flexibility. Yet this image quickly collapses when juxtaposed with Russia's actions on the battlefield and its unchanged political demands. The contrast between conciliatory language and coercive reality is not accidental, it is the essence of Moscow's negotiating style. The peace framework under discussion, initially a 28-point document, later reduced to 20 points, underscores how uneven the diplomatic terrain has become. Even after revisions, much of the plan reportedly remained unfavorable to Ukraine, particularly on the issue of territory. The most contentious proposal involves Donbass, where Russia demands a full Ukrainian withdrawal from the Donetsk region, while Kiev insists that any withdrawal must be mutual. By floating ideas such as a free economic zone or a so-called demilitarized zone, Moscow reframes territorial control as a technical or economic question rather than a matter of sovereignty. This rhetorical shift is designed to make territorial concessions appear pragmatic rather than existential. Putin's claim that the ball is on the West's side is another familiar inversion of responsibility. In reality, Russia continues to advance maximalist conditions rooted in its 2024 demands, which effectively amount to enforced territorial loss for Ukraine. Peace, as defined by the Kremlin, is not the restoration of internationally recognized borders, but the formalization of gains achieved through force. This framing places Western governments in a diplomatic trap, press Ukraine to accept unjust terms and risk undermining international law, or refuse and be accused of prolonging the war. The credibility of Russia's peace rhetoric is further weakened by developments on the front lines. Even as Putin speaks of dialogue, Russian forces continue active offensives in eastern Ukraine. His claims that Russian troops have taken or control cities such as Siversk, Pokrovsk, Vovchansk, and Kupiansk have been directly contradicted by visible evidence, including President Volodymyr Zelensky's public visit to Kupiansk. The Kremlin's dismissal of this visit as a fake only reinforces the perception that information warfare is being waged alongside military operations. When reality undermines official statements, propaganda steps in to fill the gap. This pattern reveals a deeper political objective: to negotiate from a position of perceived momentum. By exaggerating territorial control and battlefield success, Moscow seeks to pressure both Ukraine and its partners into believing that time is on Russia's side. In such a context, compromises become synonymous with Ukrainian concessions, while Russian withdrawals are never seriously contemplated. Peace talks, therefore, function less as a path to resolution and more as a tool to consolidate advantage. Putin's comments on frozen Russian assets in the European Union add another layer to this strategy. Labeling the potential transfer of these assets to Ukraine as robbery and threatening prolonged legal battles, he signals that Russia intends to contest accountability on every front: military, diplomatic, and financial. The mention of courts and independent jurisdictions is telling. It suggests an attempt to delay consequences rather than accept responsibility, buying time while the conflict grinds on. By publicly endorsing talks while privately clinging to uncompromising goals, the Kremlin aims to fracture Western unity, exploit differences in risk tolerance, and shift blame for continued bloodshed onto others. The danger is that repeated declarations of readiness for peace, unchallenged by facts, may gradually erode public resolve abroad. The final and most disturbing dimension of Putin's narrative collapse emerges when his claims of restraint and peaceful intent are placed alongside documented evidence of prohibited warfare methods. In 2025 alone, Ukrainian military authorities recorded 6,540 instances of Russian forces using hazardous chemical substances against Ukrainian troops, with the peak occurring in April, when 894 cases were documented in a single month. Over the full course of the war, nearly 12,000 such incidents have been recorded. These are not abstract numbers; they represent a systematic pattern that directly contradicts Moscow's portrayal of itself as a responsible actor seeking to reduce human suffering. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Russian units have repeatedly deployed K-51 and RGVO gas grenades containing CS and CN chemicals. While these agents are commonly associated with riot control and peacetime law enforcement, their use in active combat zones is explicitly prohibited under international humanitarian law, including the 1993 Chemical Weapons Convention. On the battlefield, these substances are not crowd control tools; they are weapons intended to disorient, incapacitate, and terrorize soldiers in enclosed or trench-based environments. Symptoms such as suffocation, severe irritation of the eyes and respiratory tract, loss of coordination, and temporary combat incapacity underscore how these chemicals are used to gain tactical advantage at the expense of basic legal and moral norms. What makes this especially significant is the mounting external confirmation. European Union institutions have, for the first time, formally accused Russia of using CS tear gas as a method of warfare in Ukraine, paving the way for new sanctions. This marks a critical shift. Allegations are no longer limited to Ukrainian reports or intercepted communications, but are entering the legal and political frameworks of international accountability. In parallel, Ukrainian radiation, chemical, and biological protection units continue to collect samples for forensic analysis, building an evidentiary record that will be difficult to dismiss in future investigations. This context exposes the hollowness of Putin's claim that Russia is not responsible for deaths because it did not start the war. Responsibility in modern warfare is cumulative. It includes the decision to escalate, the methods chosen to fight, and the willingness to comply with international law. The use of prohibited chemical agents, combined with ongoing offensives and uncompromising territorial demands, places Russia in direct contradiction with its own declared desire for peace. Denial, in this case, is not merely rhetorical, it is operational. This strategy of denial carries long-term risks, not only for Ukraine but for the international system as a whole. If a nuclear-armed state can wage a large-scale invasion, employ banned weapons, and still frame itself as a misunderstood peacemaker, the precedent is dangerous. It signals that accountability can be postponed indefinitely through narrative manipulation, legal obstruction, and diplomatic fatigue. Over time, such tactics threaten to normalize violations that were once considered red lines. From a personal analytical perspective, the most striking element of Putin's statements is not their cynicism, but their consistency. The same logic underpins every claim. Russia is always reacting, never acting, responding, never initiating, forced, never choosing. This worldview leaves no room for responsibility, and therefore no genuine pathway to peace. A settlement built on denial cannot be stable because it refuses to acknowledge the harm already done.